welcome back to Infamous Indie. I'm your host, That Dead Girl, and basically what I do here is I sit down and I share with you a true crime story from my home state of Indiana. And I'm being joined by a very special guest today. This is my cat Zero. He's hanging out with me, and today we are going to finally get into part 2 of the Heather Norris story. And I know a lot of you have been anxiously waiting for the conclusion to this story, and I do apologize. The last month or so has been pretty hectic for me. I got a new promotion at work, so that definitely means working longer hours. My boyfriend's in a band, so they've had a lot of shows and things like that going on. We've had Pride Festival, it's been very, very busy. I literally have not had a single moment to myself to actually sit down and, hang out with you guys. So today I have plenty of time, so I'm going to be working on a lot of new things. So definitely look out for those. And we're just going to get right down into part 2 of the Heather Norris story. Now, in the last video, we essentially just gave a little bit of background on Heather and, kind of established that timeline of violence between Heather and Joshua Bean. And I believe we left off with Joshua going on a vacation to Mexico with his friend David Dawson, and while on vacation, he actually confesses to David what he's done to Heather. It's important to note that Joshua would later go on to refute all of these statements that he had made to David, stating that he was under the influence of alcohol and Xanax at the time, and he didn't really know what he was saying. So basically, whatever the circumstances, he tells David that he and Heather had actually gotten into an argument on the night of April 10th, 2007. I don't know whether or not I mentioned this in the previous video, but the argument had actually started over Heather threatening to call the police on Joshua for allegedly growing marijuana in his basement. Joshua claims that at some point, Heather came at him and attacked him with a steak knife, and then the two would eventually get into a struggle over the knife. At some point during this altercation, Joshua claims to have accidentally slit Heather's throat, and he claims that this was all purely in self-defense. I'm basically leaving it up to every one of you to, come to a conclusion and form your own opinions, but in my personal opinion, I do not buy the self-defense claim. Simply because we've already seen in the past what Joshua Bean is capable of, as far as abuse and things like that. So if this was an instance where Heather chose to fight back, I absolutely do not blame her for that, and in my mind, I just can't see how he can justify this as self-defense. Also, how do you accidentally, slit someone's throat? To me, that seems pretty intentional. That's just my opinion. And as I mentioned before, in the previous video, Heather's parents at this time had already filed a missing persons report. And if you remember, no one has seen or heard from Heather since the early weeks of April 2007. Flash forward just a little bit, and now we come to the end of April, and David and Joshua return home from their vacation in Mexico. What was kind of interesting to me is that I couldn't really find any information about this David Dawson person. My main question was, why did he not immediately go to the police with this information? Was this a situation where he didn't believe Joshua's story? Was he afraid of Joshua? Or was he simply just trying to help Joshua cover this up? So anyway, Joshua and David are back from Mexico, and if you do remember in the first video, I mentioned that Heather's father actually went to Joshua's house searching for Heather early on in the investigation, and Joshua was not home. So this would have been around the time that he had gone to Mexico with his friend David. Shortly after David and Joshua return home from Mexico, Heather's car ends up being found on May 8th, 2007, at a hotel on the west side. So this was strikingly odd because this was not any sort of place that Heather would be basically caught dead hanging out at. So to find her car there was definitely suspicious. It's now towards the end of May, and actually on May 24th, 2007, Joshua Bean actually comes to find out that police want to speak with him in regards to Heather's disappearance. Now, Joshua, being the narcissistic prick that he is, he actually ends up calling the police station and leaving a message telling them that any questions for him need to be directed to his attorney. To me, that basically means, I'm guilty, I'm not talking to you, you need to speak with my attorney. That's just my opinion, though. That very same day, police would actually end up obtaining a search warrant to search Joshua's home and surrounding property. Police would end up searching Joshua's home, like, inside and out, even bringing in cadaver dogs and things like that. And with no surprise, the search actually disclosed the presence of human remains. Just 2 days later, on May 26, 2007, Joshua's father and uncle would end up contacting police to tell them that Joshua Bean had confessed to them what he had done to Heather. The missing persons case then officially became a murder case, and Joshua Bean was arrested at the home of his cousin that very same day. So Joshua was then taken into custody and sat down with investigators to try and give his, story of the events that occurred. Joshua Bean then began to tell police the real story of what happened to Heather Norris on the night of April 10th, 2007. Now, he ended up giving police and investigators the same spiel about, self-defense. She came at me with a steak knife. I was only trying to defend myself. This was all an accident. But this time, he would actually admit to stabbing Heather with the steak knife several times in the basement of his home. He went on to tell police that he burned Heather's body in a large trash can and then proceeded to cut up the body into smaller pieces using a chainsaw. And what he tells the investigators next, I can imagine was very shocking. He took these pieces of Heather's body that he had already, dismembered with a chainsaw, and he placed them into approximately 10 different trash bags. He then took these trash bags and disposed of them at several different locations on the south side of Indianapolis. He would also go on to admit that he, painted the walls of the basement. He cleaned the area with bleach, and he actually had hired a company to come in and remove the carpet and replace it. So not only did he murder Heather so viciously, he went to great lengths to try to cover up his crimes. And if all of that, wasn't bad enough or, enough to make your spine tingle, he ends up telling police that the last words that Heather ever said were, "I love you, Joshua." So with Joshua's statements and banking information and receipts and security camera footage, investigators were able to actually put together a timeline of Joshua's whereabouts during the initial disappearance of Heather Norris. So we know this all starts with Heather not answering or returning any phone calls, in early April. Sometime during the night of April 10th, an argument ensued between Joshua and Heather, which eventually would lead to Heather's death. On the morning of April 11th, Joshua was due to go to a very important work meeting at his place of employment, and he would actually not end up going to this meeting. I'm guessing, all that murder and everything, just made him really exhausted, and he just, couldn't bear to go to work the next day. Joshua's supervisor would then call him, leaving a message, around 9 a.m., to which Joshua would respond by email around 9:30 a.m. In this email, Joshua tells his boss that he's just sick and not able to come to work. He would then go on to call the director of the company with a completely different story. Joshua tells the director of the company that he was actually attacked by 2 individuals and that he had been seen by a doctor to receive stitches, and also that he had a doctor's note excusing him from work for the rest of the week. On April 11th, 2007, there is actually proof that Joshua sought medical attention from an urgent care center. He was seen around 12:39 p.m. for cuts and abrasions to his arms and hands. Now, Joshua would basically end up telling this doctor that he was carrying a trash bag full of broken beer bottles when somehow the bag busted and the broken beer bottles had fallen down on his arms and hands, cutting him. I mean, the dude's not even a good liar. Now, one can only assume that all these cuts and marks on Joshua's body were from Heather fighting for her life. Joshua would go on to receive more than 28 stitches, on his arms and hands. On April 12th, Joshua would end up purchasing a chainsaw, a cotton mop, trash bags, and several other incriminating items from a local business. He would also go on to rent a Rug Doctor carpet cleaner, a cleaning solution for said carpet cleaner, and a plethora of other cleaning supplies. And it was during this time in early to mid-April that Joshua began telling all of his friends and family that he and Heather had broken up. Shortly after this, the sister of one of Joshua Bean's neighbors actually reported seeing Joshua driving Heather's car away from his home while wearing blue latex gloves. And also during this time, remember David, the friend that had gone on the vacation to Mexico with Joshua? Well, he comes to pay Joshua a visit and notices a strange odor within the basement. Now, Joshua, he just shrugs this off and basically says, oh, well, there was a fire that started in this big trash can. Someone threw a lit cigarette into it and, it just caught on fire. So at this point, police basically have everything they need down to this perfect timeline. They have Joshua Bean dead to rights. There's absolutely no way he can get out of any of this at this point. And so on May 31st, 2007, Joshua Bean was charged with murder and the abuse of a corpse. Oh, Joshua. He would go on to try and file a motion to suppress the statements he made to police during the initial conversation they had. He would go on to say that he was under the influence of alcohol and Xanax, the same story he used about his confession to David in Mexico. And Joshua would just continue to file these motions to try to get out of any sort of punishment for his crimes against Heather. First, it was he didn't want the court to admit evidence from his previous charges, from incidents with Heather. He felt that this would essentially sway the jury, against him. He also claimed to have never been given the chance to obtain proper counsel, along with claims that he was actually being abused and extorted in lockup, and he wanted to be moved to solitary because he felt like his life was in danger. Oh, poor baby. The judge, not being a complete moron, would go on to deny all of these motions. On September 5th, 2008, Joshua Bean would end up being sentenced to 65 years for murder and an additional 3 years for abuse of a corpse. Both of these sentences to be served consecutively. So, in the end, the bad guy loses. All of his lies and fuckery were just not enough to keep him from, atoning for the crimes that he committed against Heather. It really makes you think about it, though. Like, is 68 years a just punishment for a crime of this nature? Like, you literally burn someone's body, first of all, you stab them to death, you burn their body, you chop them up with a chainsaw, and then scatter their body all around the city. 68 years, you did this to this human being, you committed an atrocity. Like, in my mind, it's not enough. But with that being said, at least there was some sort of justice served here. To me, the hardest thing about this case, or, the most devastating thing, has got to be the fact that even though he was convicted of murder, he's rotting away, in prison for however long. But there's really no closure here, and I know I talk about closure a lot for victims and their families, but Heather's body has never been found. And sadly, because of the way he chose to dispose of her remains, she will probably never be found. And in a rare occasion, I've actually had the pleasure of talking to and speaking with a lot of you who actually did know Heather and did go to school with her. While speaking with a mutual acquaintance, she actually told me that every time she sees a black trash bag, she wonders somewhere in the back of her mind, could Heather be in there? And for me, like, this is the impact that this monster, Joshua Bean, has had on Heather and so many people who loved her and cared for her. You know, I mentioned at the start of this story that it's a very dark story. It's very, very heavy content. And I did want to try and do my best to sort of end this video on somewhat of a positive note, because Heather's death was not the end of her story. And if you'll recall, I did mention in part 1 of this series that Heather was quoted as saying she felt as though that she was put on this earth to help other people. Now, it may not have turned out to be in the way that she hoped for or imagined, but Heather Norris would end up doing just that. In the wake of Heather's death, her mother Deborah really just took charge, and she began traveling to different high schools all across Indiana to share Heather's story in hopes that she could maybe reach someone who was struggling with the same thing. Debbie would also go on to create a website in Heather's memory, telling her story called Heather's Voice. On January 18, 2009, a special ceremony was held at Perry Meridian High School where Heather attended school. They presented her parents with her number 24 jersey, which has since been retired. A scholarship was also created in Heather's name called the Heather Norris Scholarship Fund, and basically what that does is it rewards a girl from the Perry Meridian girls basketball team a scholarship for school. On April 12, 2010, Mitch Daniels signs Heather's Law into existence. Basically, Heather's Law made it to where every school has to have training and education about dating, sexual abuse, and domestic violence. I think through grades 6 through 12. It is now a required part of the educational curriculum. Heather's Law would also go on to help change policies in regards to reporting and responding to cases like this that have to do with domestic violence. Also in 2013, Heather's Closet was established, and this was a program where young girls could get discounted prom dresses by attending a learning experience focusing on teen dating violence and domestic violence. And with that being said, this has been, you know, the tragic tale of Heather Norris. And I think I mentioned, you know, I do know a lot of people who knew her, and I have only heard nothing but wonderful things about her. And what happened to her is unfortunate. It's very sad. It's really hard to talk about. And the only thing that we can do now is share Heather's story to make sure her voice is still heard, and that in sharing these stories and the situation and the things that Heather had gone through, maybe we can help reach other people and, you know, help them leave a situation that could end up endangering their lives. I will be posting some numbers to some resources if you or anyone you know is suffering at the hands of domestic abuse or dating violence, anything like that. Like I said, I'll be posting that information at the end of this video for anyone who may need it. And as always, thank you so much for hanging out with me. Thank you for tuning in to hear Heather's story. And as always, if you like what I'm doing here at Infamous Indie, please feel free to like and share my content. And if you're new here, also don't forget to like and subscribe, just so I know that you're out here and I'm not just, sitting around talking to a bunch of cats. And as always, stay spooky, keep it creepy, and watch your back because it's a crazy fucking world out there.